speaking of writers, it's my pleasure to once again have Andrew Weiner with us. And this really came about because in our wandering through the galleries when we were obsessed with Velasquez Suarez and actually remain obsessed with Velasquez Suarez, he discovered our Martin Johnson Heade painting and was enthralled and mentioned his joy at seeing it and his own connection to that. So that's how this came about. So art can sometimes seem best when allowed to remain, as Henry James wrote, the so beautifully unsaid. But we, as docents, as facilitators, as teachers, necessarily seek out the words that might help visitors connect. Author and artist Andrew Weiner, whose words and ideas so beautifully opened up the art of Velasquez Suarez and Any Moment Now, when he spoke to us in September, returns today to take a closer look at paintings in our American collection and in particular the work of Martin Johnson Heade. Heade, whose hummingbirds found their way into Emily Dickinson's Route of Evanescence. Heade, whose flowers were described by John Updike as petaled odalisques. Heade, who, it turns out, has been a kind of moody muse for Andrew. At one point, he even considered this undersung artist as inspiration for a novel, and perhaps today's experience will rekindle that desire. He is already the author of 2 novels, The Marriage Artist, copies of which he has graciously agreed to sign outside the auditorium when this lecture is finished, and The Color Midnight Maid. He also publishes philosophical and literary essays, conducts public conversations with fellow authors, several of which have occurred on this stage, and speaks about art, religion, and literature. He is chair of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, a recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Fiction. Presently, he is co-authoring a book on what Nietzsche has to say to the contemporary layperson and completing a new novel about American religion and politics. Please join me in welcoming Andrew as he turns the elegant and exact observation of his fiction to reconsidering with us works of art and artists from our American collection. Andrew.
Can you hear me? This is on? Okay. Good morning. Yeah, what a treat. Heade has been important to me since I was in college, and first discovered his, well, the first thing I guess I saw were his haystacks in the salt marshes, which we'll look at in a bit. And then I discovered the hummingbirds, and all these years later, I've become a birder, so the connections kind of are multiform. And I did find him enigmatic and mysterious, and very seriously considered him as kind of the protagonist of a novel, but I ultimately decided against it. But I'm here today to talk about Heade, and I also want to talk about George Inness, another of the, it was the Hudson School. This is backfiring a little bit. There was the Hudson School of painters, and then there were, now we call them the Luminists. Some of you might be familiar with these terms. And this whole period of kind of mid to late 19th century American landscape painters, I guess you might say. But I think that kind of does several of them a disservice, particularly Heade, and I would also argue George Inness. And in this very elite group that kind of highlighting, I would also include Albert Pinkham Ryder. I'm not sure if any of you have seen his work. Very enigmatic. These are the real kind of unique painters that I think history has shown actually stand out. And what's interesting about that is that history forgot about Martin Johnson Heade. Even though he was very close with Mark Twain, he knew Emily Dickinson, of course. He was very connected in many ways. He taught, what's his name, Tiffany, when Tiffany was young. So there are all these kind of amazing connections that he'd had, and yet he wasn't the big painter that someone like Edwin Church was, or Thomas Cole even of his day. And part of that was because he didn't paint he didn't paint Niagara Falls and these kind of big romantic, he wasn't he missed the whole romantic school. While the romantics were painting these kind of allegorical, slightly religious paintings, Heade was doing these weird little haystacks and flowers, and he kind of sat that out. And then he went into obscurity, and it wasn't until World War II that someone discovered him at a garage sale, really. And then, curators, he started to get noticed, and by 1946, there were a couple of very serious exhibitions in New York that reintroduced Heade to the world. I want to read something that Patsy mentions John Updike, that Updike says about this in relation to him being forgotten. Like Vermeer, Heade blended into the art of his time and needed posterity to recognize the exceptional quality and concentration beneath his quiet surface. A better analogy might be Emily Dickinson, Updike writes, whose lonely oddity emerged as a profound integrity. And I love that idea of going it on your own as an artist, as something of an outlier, an oddity, but that history realizes that that's actually an integrity. Okay. Can we start these slides, please? Yeah. So this is actually a photograph taken in the late 1800s of the San Francisco Bay. And it's taken from Berkeley. So you might be able to figure out what that is. The city is on the left, Sausalito and Marin are on the right, and the ship is going out to where the Golden Gate is now. I've always loved this photo. I mean, when I came across this, not just because I grew up in the East Bay, but the photograph was just astounding to me. And I paired it with Emily Dickinson, with whom I'm pairing Heade today for this talk, for reasons that you'll understand in a second. To see the summer sky is poetry, though never in a book, that's cut off. Though never in a book it lie, true poems flee, sorry. So let me read it again. To see the summer sky is poetry, though never in a book it lie, true poems flee. And I chose this poem because something happens in the mid-19th century, a kind of shift toward new thoughts about nature, about life being an ephemeral thing. And a big part of this has to do with Darwin, right? Another part of it has to do with the Civil War in America. And Patsy mentions this other poem that Emily, I call her Emily, she's my friend. And I want to just pause there for a second because I want to say something about that. You'll notice a theme in this talk today, and it's a theme of my relationship to art, and one thing I want to encourage museum goers is a kind of intimacy with artists and with the things that they make. And so when I call her Emily, it's actually the deepest kind of respect. It's not disrespect. It's something else. I've had a lifelong conversation with Dickinson, just as I've had a lifelong conversation with Heade. And so they become the first name to you, don't they? And I want to talk today about erasing the distance between us and these works that we've inherited. It's on us, and it's our obligation to tend to these works. And one way we tend to them is to kind of get rid of what separates them from us, and so not just from you, but from the people you're talking to when they come into this museum. But she writes another poem that Patsy mentioned called A Route of Evanescence. And that's such a beautiful, a route of evanescence, as if the path of life is the route, and it's an evanescent one. And so this is the kind of thinking that starts to really occur at a not just an individual level, not just for Dickinson, but it starts to happen at a cultural level, at an aesthetic level, at an intellectual level. And different artists start to pick it up, and thinkers and writers. It's no accident that Dickinson comes about in proximity and roughly in the same time as Emerson. Okay, so we have Emerson. I'm going to talk about Emerson in a second. Now, the thing about Dickinson is that she doesn't look at nature and find correlatives in it. Nature is her language. Her thought, she erases the separation between herself and nature. And so one way she does that is through the ecstatic. Okay? Her relationship to nature is an ecstatic one. And one reason we kind of think now that Dickinson isolated herself in her family's house was so that she could maintain some sort of purity in her relationship with nature, even though really it was just her garden, right? It wasn't as if she was going out and hiking the White Mountains in Vermont. She was also very interested in science, so science and nature, but her thinking went beyond science, and the way it went beyond science was through her imagination. Okay? And I want to make a distinction between knowing and imagining. There was a great Viennese aphorist, Alfred Polgar, who, before he jumped out his window to his death on the day that the Nazis moved into Vienna, said this. He writes this: "The Nazis know exactly what they're doing. They just cannot imagine it." Okay? So this distinction between knowing and imagining is crucial, and I want to try to understand it through the works of Heade. But let's first look at a few of Heade's contemporaries. I'm not sure what "please wait" is. Please wait. So here we have a contemporary of Heade, some cows by the river. This might be from a Constable painting. It could be from any number of painters from this period on either coast, either side of the Atlantic. Here's why I'm showing this painting before we get to Heade. I want to read to you a line by another great aphorist of the 20th century, Cioran, and he says, "The public hurls itself upon the authors called human." Okay? "The public knows it has nothing to fear from them. Halted like their readers halfway down the road, these authors propose compromises with the impossible, a coherent vision of chaos." Now this is Cioran criticizing the authors that are being praised in his day. The ones, we often see blurbs on books that say, "so deeply human." And we kind of buy into it. We think, that's great, I got to read this book. But Cioran is saying, no, this is not the great work. And one of the reasons that he posits this is because we have nothing to fear from these authors. That they're, in a sense, lying to us. They're presenting us with art like this, in a sense. Now, don't get me wrong, I grew up looking at paintings like this, and I took great comfort from them as a child. And in some of my worst moments, I still do look at paintings like this and derive kind of a certain kind of comfort from them. But I cannot tell you that it's great art. Okay? So anyway, what's implied here is that real art, great art, is something to be afraid of. This is a painting that's in the collection here. And Patsy's saying, why is he talking negatively about the collection? And I'm not really, because, I could actually, there's something, again, there's a certain wistfulness and certain qualities that I would find that I like in this painting. But let's look at Dickinson again. "Because you saturated sight, I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise." Okay? Dickinson told the truth. She's talking to a lover here. She's talking to her lover, whom she can't have. The you is the lover, but it's also the lover is the reality as she sees it. he's on the ground, right? The you is us here on the ground. Paradise is elsewhere, is something else. And she can't see paradise anymore because she's too kind of enthralled and saturated with what is surrounding her here on the ground. Okay? Now we're starting to get a little bit closer. This is Thomas Moran, and I believe this is also in the collection. And I'm starting to get a little happier here, but I'm not quite. And I want to read something that the writer Philip Roth says about Saul Bellow. He says, "To hoist the author's thinking up from the depths to the narrative's surface without sinking the narrative's mimetic power." Now this is Roth praising what Bellow does. And the same could be said for the greatest painters and the greatest poets. We understand this to be a landscape. So the mimetic quality, mimesis. Do we all know what mimesis is? Right? Who knows what mimesis is? Who would like to tell us what mimesis is? What's a mimetic quality?
It replicates what
Replicates?
we perceive to be reality.
Reproduce reality? Yeah, right. So we understand this to be a landscape. And yet there's more of the depths of the author's kind of voice coming up here, isn't there? Okay? What I want to say is that the best painting then has much in common with the best prose. All right? We experience, the painter is less interested in saying, look, here's Niagara Falls. Isn't that amazing? Right? Or here's Yosemite Valley. Albert Bierstadt. Look at the Great Rocky Mountains. Or this religious allegory. But it has more to do with, here, let's experience what it's like to actually be out here. Let's have this experience, okay? There's more of an ecstatic relationship to nature. Let's get rid of these signifiers like Niagara Falls, which just is this big wall between us and actually being there, okay? And let's be one with nature. The way I was talking about Emily Dickinson's thinking is embedded with and indeed part of nature, okay? Wallace Stevens kind of weighs in on something similar. He says in this poem, "We live in a constellation of patches and pitches, not in a single world." And I want to pause here for a second, because when he says not in a single world, he's saying the same thing that Sjoren is saying about the so-called human authors. These authors that Sjoren's talking about are saying we can comprehend a kind of unity in the chaos. And Sjoren says, no, we can't, and so does Wallace Stevens. Not in a single world, but in patches and pitches. In things said well in music, on the piano and in speech, as in a page of poetry, thinkers without final thoughts, in an always incipient cosmos, the way when we climb a mountain, Vermont throws itself together. Isn't that amazing, that last line? It does the thing that we all wish we can do at the end of a paragraph or a stanza, it takes this kind of constellation of ideas and suddenly makes it come into focus, doesn't it? Gives it that final spin. And we sense in this poem that we're on this hike, we're not taking in all of Vermont at once, but there's a view here down this arroyo, right? There's a twig here. There's a bird there that we just saw. This little squirrel just skidded away there. There's my hunger in my stomach. I'm dehydrated. Am I going to die on this mountain? All these things. That's Vermont throwing itself together. And then there's that sudden moment up there that you might have of just absolute kind of peace, or whatever the experience is. But it's not this kind of unified whole that gives us a comforting vision. Okay? So I want to remember a couple of things here as we continue, and one of them is this idea of patches, of experiencing things in patches and pitches. And the other is an always incipient cosmos. What does incipient mean? What is it?
The beginning.
The beginning? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's this idea of coming into being, of a kind of revelation, an ongoing sense of something being revealed or disclosed. I also want to remember this idea of the world throwing itself together for us, okay, and our involvement in that. This has a lot to do with how we're going to interact with these art pieces. So here's our first Martin Johnson Heade. Heade goes down to Brazil at the invitation of the emperor there, and he starts to paint. And while this kind of seems like an illustration, he doesn't. It's not illustrating some idea the way that Church's Niagara Falls does. Okay. It's not a particular place. It's not a historical moment. It's not a religious thought. His paintings suggest that whatever kind of contact we have with meaning, it comes in flickers, in the beating of a hummingbird wing. There's also something dark here. Humanity, us, only seem to be getting things in these kind of glimpses of beauty that are slightly terrifying. You know, Rilke wrote about this experience of beauty as nothing but the beginning of terror, which we are barely able to endure. And we are so awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us. And a contemporary of Heade and of Dickinson, who knew them both, was the minister Henry Ward Beecher. And Beecher wrote this thing about his childhood, this moment, when he was describing, I'm sorry, this is not about his childhood. He was describing encountering great works of art. And here's what Beecher said. To find myself absolutely intoxicated, to find my system so much affected that I could not control my nerves, to find myself trembling and laughing and weeping and almost hysterical. Why did I read that? Because it has something to do with the way that I now go into a museum. And I want to talk to you a bit about my kind of experience of museums now, and with the hope that maybe there's something you can take from it. I basically look at museum. I walk into a museum now and I instantly get very happy. Okay? I have this, it's the feeling that I can't believe they exist. I really can't, especially now. And I'm grateful for all the people that came before me who put these things together. I mean, and of course people like you sitting in here today. But these works of art harbored in these museums, as I said earlier, are our inheritance. And so I feel that when I walk into a museum. I already have this sense of kind of gratitude. And I also have a sense of a kind of discovery that's going to happen. Okay? And then I start walking into the rooms. And this thing happens now where I start to smile. I smile at the other people in the museum, and then I start to look at the work, and I become filled with joy. And I have these kind of, I can only call it ecstatic experiences in front of these works. And I interact with them. I don't just look at them wholly, but I start to do things with them. And I want to try to model for you and illustrate to you what that is. And it has everything to do with what Stevens is talking about with patches and pitches. So this is the same painting, but this is how I start to look at it. And I don't just do this visually, but being a contemporary human being, I take out my phone and I start taking pictures. And I start taking close-ups and I penetrate these paintings in patches and pitches. And in this way, I let the world of the paintings start to throw themselves together. And I hope that you see that if you're looking at this, it's a very different feeling in our body and in our kind of psychic emotional centers than this or that, isn't it? For me, I love the ephemeral evanescence to this part of the painting. And so I go up to the painting, and I'm looking at just this, and I have a very different feeling. And then I walk away. I go to a whole different room. This just happened to me, by the way. I was in Spain. I'd never been to Madrid. And I'm sure some of you here have. And in the Prado, was it the Thyssen or the Prado? I think it was the Prado. They had two Martin Johnson Heades. And that museum is filled with remarkable things. But when I understood there were a couple Heades in there, I became very happy. And I beelined it. I passed up all this kind of 18th century work, 17th century, I just went straight to the Heades. These two American paintings by this weird American guy here in the Prado in Spain. And I had this kind of interaction there, and I started looking around at other people and smiling like I was some mystic weirdo, just scaring people. But it was because I was doing this, and I took a ton of pictures like that. I let the painting throw itself together for me. This is one of my favorite paintings that I've had in my, it's been a part of my life for 30 years now. It's a very tiny painting. It's only 10 inches. And it's by Albert Pinkham Ryder. I was kind of disappointed to see that this collection, which actually is a fantastic collection of 19th century work, here in this museum, didn't have a Ryder that I could see, or does it? I don't think it does. Ryder's very difficult. He only made a few paintings, and he used terrible paints. And the paintings are rotting, they're peeling, they're coming. I mean, the best preservers in the world are fighting to keep Pinkham alive. But anyway, what I love about this painting is it was just a study that he did out in the field in Litchfield, Connecticut. Litchfield, Connecticut. And what's interesting about Litchfield is it's where Heade and Ward Beecher both lived for a time. So there are all these connections. Pinkham Ryder, Beecher, the great sermonizer, and Martin Johnson Heade. But this was just a painting of a field and a tree that Pinkham Ryder does. And to me, it's a patch. It's a patch. It's not the whole. It's not a whole painting. It's one of these patches. And I think the patches allow you to have this kind of experience that a larger painting that you can understand does not. Let's look at Henry Ward Beecher. Oh, here's the description I wanted to read you earlier. When I was a boy in Litchfield, I used to sit in the door of my home, listening to the wind and the branches over my head, looking up at the sky. I could hear the faint hum of the spinning wheel in the garret, and a tender sadness seemed to gather about me and melt my nature, till I cried like a grieved child. What was it? And I love, the reason I chose this, not just because of Beecher's connection to Dickinson and Heade, was that question, what was it? Because I think that's the question that we need to bring to these paintings and these objects in these museums. What is it? What is that thing, that intangible thing? I would argue that that thing is this awareness of life's mortality that I was talking about that started to happen around the Civil War and in the mid-century. It was an awareness of our own death. Of course, the Civil War brought death into this massive kind of consciousness in the country. But this awareness of our mortality then becomes a kind of an ask, a question. And the ask is an intimate one. How can I kind of companion my mortality and my death? If I know that I've read Darwin, and I know that life seems to have this kind of brutal indifference to us, what can I still hold on to? Okay? And I think one of the things that we're still always looking for is meaning and significance. And we turn then to the great art and the great poets and the great writers for that kind of significance. So this kind of question of what is it, this kind of ask, is something that we repeat over and over. We perform it again and again. And yet art isn't church. Okay? Now this is one of Martin Johnson Heade's salt marshes that he painted many times over. And again, it's not a place we recognize. It distinguished him so much. People were confused because they were so used to the bombastic kind of romanticism of the great Hudson school painters that when they saw these, they couldn't understand. They couldn't understand, why is he painting this nondescript peat bog across from New York, out there in Newark, or up in Newburyport? Why is he painting these things? Later in April, I'm going to be back here in conversation with who I arguably is the greatest living poet in the world now, Adam Zagajewski. And so I chose to kind of, as a prelude to that, and because it was relevant to what I'm trying to say here, part of a poem he wrote. What's the moment when divinity appears? Adam writes. How can we tell, since we always keep it in the past tense or the future, hopefully? We describe it from a distant country where we've been carried by a wild express train. That's, in a way, that's what my way of saying that unlike church, for example, where we tend to seek the answers, our relationship to art and this question of mortality and death and meaning is more like seeing it from a distant country where we've been carried on a wild train. So here's another one, and this is, again, this example of what I'm talking about. When you look at a Heade, there's something dark in them, something intangible, something frightening. It takes me back to Sioran's quote, that we have something to fear from this artist, and that's a good thing. He's telling us the truth, or at least, if he's not telling us a truth, he's not lying to us. He's not lying to us. And again, with a painting like this, if I had my way, I would go up into this corner and find a patch. And I'd find a patch down here. And I'd let this painting try to assemble the world for me. Throw it together, like Stephen said. Let me read another Updike quote, because I think he's right. Heade's calm, there is a certain calmness to these paintings, is unsteady, storm-stirred. We respond in our era to its hint of the nervous and the fearful. His weather is interior weather. Okay? So again, going back to Dickinson. Dickinson's poems perform thought. They don't look at thought, they are thought. And it's the same thing with a Heade. This is interior thought, interior mood, as Updike says. And he perhaps was, if far from the first to portray a modern mood, an ambivalent mood tinged with dread and yet imbued with a certain lightness. The mood could even be said to be religious, Updike says. Not an aggressive preachment of God's grandeur, and there I can't help but think of the other painters like Moran and Church, and Thomas Cole, but a kind of zen poise and acceptance. It's his kind of movement of hand and mind that move us. And again, I would argue that it's an awareness of death and light and ephemeral. Life's ephemerality. There's a certain mourning in these paintings, and it's no accident that many of them were painted during the Civil War and slightly after. There's something to be said about this kind of art when we think of significance, because we're aware of they have this elegiac quality. They can kind of orient us ethically to the world. I don't tend to like to use art in a utilitarian way, so I don't mean to sound so literalist. But you know, the Greeks, as the Greeks said, there's a relationship between beauty, and I mean not prettiness, not surface beauty, but real beauty and the good, right? This is why when I have a very different experience then toward the world, toward other people, in the presence of a work like this than I do with the Yosemite Falls painting, let's just say. When I see the big romantic painting by Bierstadt, I think, well, yes, but that's romanticism, and it's a gloss on the reality of our situation. Now, this is also because we are post-Civil War, we're post-Darwin, and now we're, of course, post the catastrophes of the 20th century. But in this way, we could say that Heade is already deeply in tune with modern and contemporary currents. This is one of his, you know, the storm is approaching. There's a sense of doom. One of my favorite poets, who's now dead and who Adam Zagajewski was very close to, was Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet. And Miłosz has this idea that an artist or writer is a secretary of the invisible. Okay? A secretary of the invisible. In other words, the artist doesn't claim to have the answer herself, his or herself. Isn't coming up with anything, but rather is taking dictation. The artist is a vehicle for something that is beyond the artist. So he had this whole other body, and this is getting us closer to the piece in this collection, which is the apple blossom. He did a whole many flowers, the magnolia. He did the orchids, which are these kind of dripping in sexuality and death, regeneration and birth. But there's something about the magnolias and indeed the apple blossoms in this collection, we'll look at that in a second, that is very isolated. And I was talking to Patsy last week, and I said, you know, he has a lot in common with Edward Hopper. If we look at Edward Hopper, who also, I would argue, is one of the very greatest American painters, there's this sense of the being in isolation. Isolation in architecture or in the landscape, a sense of loneliness. And it connects to Dickinson's poem here. It might be lonelier without the loneliness. You know, that's such a great, we'll talk about this in a second. I'm so accustomed to my fate, perhaps the other piece would interrupt the dark and crowd the little room, too scant by cubits to contain the sacrament of him. Now this is Emily, again, writing both. She's working on everything. She's working the religious, she's working the erotic, the denial of the lover, okay? The loneliness because her lover, who happened to be a minister, the man she really loved was a minister who preferred ultimately Jesus over her, and they were separated by other more pragmatic problems too. But what's so fascinating about Dickinson's thought here, and what it has to do with Hopper and Heade, is that loneliness can actually be a balm against a worse loneliness. So she finds strength where she's most weak. Do you see? Most vulnerable. This aligns her, by the way, with another very important figure in the world at exactly the same time, the philosopher Nietzsche. Okay? And the connection is not arbitrary. I'm not making an arbitrary connection, because Emerson is the big kind of influence in America, of course on Dickinson and others like James. And Nietzsche reads Emerson, and it changes his life. And Emerson and Nietzsche have this idea that what can heal us is to be found precisely where we are sick. In other words, where we are most ill and weak is the ground upon which we can stand up and affirm life. This is a profound paradoxical kind of insight. And Dickinson is saying the same thing. She's going to protect herself with loneliness, against loneliness. And when we look at a painting like this, or like a Hopper, there's a strength in those paintings, even though they're about isolation and loneliness and death. They're protecting us in a way from that. They give us a certain kind of vitality in the life that we have. I want to say one other thing about Emerson on this point, because I think it's fascinating. And it's a crucial moment in Emerson's life. His first wife dies. And they bury her. And he's preaching at the church in Boston there. I was just there. Let's see, I can't remember. It doesn't matter. And after about a year, he's still tortured by her death. And he doesn't really believe she's gone. He can't believe it. Emerson can't believe it. He's too sensitive. And one night, in a kind of fit of all these emotions, he goes out and he digs her up. Yeah. He needs to see it. He needs to see her. And what he sees there is what you can imagine. But it's beyond all of his imagining. Okay? And this is it. He quits. It's such a momentous loss. I mean, he experiences both a loss of faith in what he's been doing, a loss of faith in an understanding of God that he had until that moment. He stops preaching, and it's when Emerson becomes Emerson. Because precisely in where he is most vulnerable, his wife's open grave, is where he draws this incredible strength and becomes our greatest poet, well, I'm going to say Emily Dickinson is her greatest poet, but Emerson becomes our greatest philosopher, our greatest thinker, and certainly our greatest writer of essays to this day. There's nobody greater. And so that to me is as good an illustration as we can find of the human ability to kind of stand up on the place where we're most assailable. Let's return to that idea of incipience, okay, and revelation, and to Stevens. You must become an ignorant man again, and see the sun again with an ignorant eye. The sun must bear no name, gold flourisher, but be in the difficulty of what it is to be. And here we're back we're with Heade in one of his tropical paintings, and I can't help but think of Dickinson's kind of palpable nearness to the facts of nature, of death, of life's kind of brevity, loneliness. And I don't think that Heade here is doing kind of this mere illustration of Darwinian ideas of evolution, which a lot of people have historically read into this work. This isn't that Darwinian kind of denial of extra meaning, that life is just this endless process of birth and death, and that there is no meaning outside of this thing. In other words, it isn't nihilism, okay? It's not nihilistic. Heidegger, who succeeded Nietzsche, said that when scientists deal with what is and nothing more, they're dealing with the nothing. He called it das Nicht. And the problem that we have with that kind of thinking with scientists today is they say, there's only what we can see, and there's nothing else. Okay? And Nietzsche correctly said about this attitude that this is nihilistic too. That science, even though he embraced science, can be nihilistic if you look at the nothing as nothing. So Heidegger says that actually the nothingness beyond the nothingness that scientists say there is actually can help us toward a richer truth. It's not a mere void, it's not a mere absence of stuff. And here's what he had to say about it, and it's very related to everything we've been talking about. So Heidegger basically said there are three things that nothingness is. He said it's kind of the withdrawal of the comforting appearances that we used to have. Okay? So I'm going back to those very first paintings I showed you. There's a sense of kind of a wholeness to the chaos, a comforting, almost religious sense that everything is beautiful ultimately. Okay? And Heidegger said the nothing it discloses a withdrawal of such appearances. Okay? And yet on the more positive side, it grants a kind of openness to that which really is. And that which really is an excess that cannot be determined. And this returns us to Dickinson and to Heade and this sense of kind of an excess that is almost erotic and ecstatic. Okay? And then finally, back to that idea of incipience. Heidegger says that the nothingness reveals the not yet determinate, the chaotic stuff of the world before it is named. And that's why I chose this Wallace Stevens. There's this kind of incipient feeling when we look. Sometimes we have these moments in our lives, you know, it even might happen when you're doing yoga, when we have the sense that I don't understand everything here, even in this room. It's too much. It hasn't been named yet. It's beyond. It's an excess of something. It's the unnameable. The difficulty of what is to be. So there's this sense that I think he captures of this continually kind of concealing and self-revealing of reality that's around us. And here I'm doing my thing again. Okay? So, this is the same painting. So one thing I want to say to you, to bring it back from the philosophical down to the reality that you have to kind of shepherd people through the museum and have them educate them, is I think that one thing you can do is invite them to use their phones in this way. And to have these kind of relationships with the works. And there's a way that they can then interact with these paintings that might seem so old to them and beyond anything in their world. And to allow these paintings to kind of throw themselves together for them. So here's the painting in our collection, okay, in the Santa Barbara collection, the apple blossoms. And I want to return to Rilke for a second, the great poet Rilke. He says, 2 inner experiences were necessary for the creation of his 2 masterpieces, 2 of the greatest poems ever written. He says, one is the increasingly conscious decision to hold life open to death. And that's kind of what we've been talking about here with Dickinson and Heade. That they held life open to death. They didn't pretend it wasn't there. The Romanticism does this, right? Romanticism, in a sense, we could say is a type of kitsch. Okay? What's kitsch?
Facile.
What is kitsch?
A facile description of things.
A what description?
Facile.
Facile? Yeah.
Tacky.
Tacky?
Something that wants to be grand but really is just pretentious.
Yeah. What's the purpose of kitsch? What's the purpose?
Comfort.
It's homey. It makes you feel like capture a cultural moment.
I heard hominess? Homey, comfort? Yeah. Yeah.
Decorate.
Decorate? Yeah. Yeah. So,
Familiar.
familiar? Yeah. Overly familiar? Yeah.
Music.
Like me.
Yeah. And what's funny is that when I introduce, I talk about kitsch to my students, and they get very upset. Very upset. Because they feel like I'm attacking them at their deepest, which is very sad. You know, the kitsch is very important to the young, it turns out. At least to college students, where they're starting to get into adult life. And adult life, of course, presents them with the world as it is. And that world is brutal sometimes. It's indifferent to them. So you retreat. You retreat to kitsch. You retreat to romanticism. You go back to Disneyland, right? It's the happiest place on earth. You buy Hello Kitty and you decorate your dorm room, right? Cows and butterflies and all those things. So, and I'm guilty of this too. I've done it in my life. We all do it. We have our needs. But why am I talking about kitsch and these things? Because I want to distinguish between these painters. And I think it's important for us to be able to make these distinctions between the great works and the works that seem good and they serve a function, but they're not the great works. Okay? Yeah. So Rilke, who was the opposite of kitsch, says, it was the decision to hold life open to death. The other is the spiritual imperative to present, in this wider context, the transformations of love, okay, of eros, that are not possible in a narrower circle where death is simply excluded as the other. Okay? So here Rilke is saying that thanatos, death, the death, is deeply necessary to eros. Okay? And he's connecting it, not explicitly here, but I'm going to do it explicitly, to this idea of plenitude, the plenitude of life that is unnameable, that is captured in these works. It's always incipient, the way life is. There's a forever incipient quality to our daily experiences. Even in our most banal days, we have appointments, we get our coffee in the morning, we go to work. If we have moments of awakeness and awareness, there's an incipience that is out just beyond us. We're trapped in our bodies, aren't we? But just beyond us, just outside of us, is something unnameable. We can't name it. And the great works are open to this. The great poems by Stevens and by Dickinson, and the statements by Emerson, and the statements by a Nietzsche and by a Rilke, they help us. They give us an aperture into what's yet to be determined and what is unnameable. And in this sense, this is the religious quality, in the best sense, in my opinion, of the best works of art. Okay, it gives us a different channel, a different way of making contact with reality. And to me, your job, when you have somebody come into this museum, is to try to help them toward that contact with reality. This is why I keep talking about ecstasy, not because I'm not talking about sex here. I'm talking about the ecstatic relation to life. Okay? I want to say something about Nietzsche for a second. I'm writing a book about Nietzsche. Nietzsche was ill. He was physically ill. And yet every day, he would put on his suit and go take a 25-mile walk in the pines above Turin in Italy, where he lived in a crappy, cold apartment. take a 25-mile walk. And on that walk, he was ecstatic, and he was thinking his thoughts, and coming up with thoughts that changed the modern mind, and it certainly led to Freud and everything else, to psychology and all things we're now dealing with. But the path for him was alive. It was illuminated. The world was illuminated. This is the kind of state that, and it's why I talked about how I enter museums now. If there's something that you can do, first of all, to put yourself into those kind of states in relation to the world and certainly to art, great art, then to try to share that and to help others to this kind of relationship. Because what you're trying to do is erasing the wall between you and reality, into the abundance. We think of reality now as this lesser thing. We've ruined reality as an idea, right? With media and television, all these things. But the truth is, and I argue, and these painters and these poets are all arguing, that reality is the deal. It is the largeness, the abundance. It is the allness. And we need to get rid of what separates us from that. And these works of art are conduits. There are conduits. It's why we turn to them. But we can't just look at reproductions of them. This is the great thing about a museum. I don't have an ecstatic experience just looking at this reproduction here. But I do when I walk into a museum now, to the actual object. I go away, I come back, I go in, I pull out, right? So, this is a painting by Andrew Weiner. Very old, and I lost it, unfortunately, but I painted this 30 years ago. And I just wanted to show you that the impact that Heade and these other painters have had on this one artist. This is just a photograph I took in Laguna Beach, where I used to live. But I think you can see that I was looking for this quality that I saw in these painters. These are just photos of the ocean. But you know, once you've lived with Heade's seascapes or his salt marshes, you then go through the world altered. Right? I now go through the world like this. I want to kind of end the lecture with a glimpse of one other painter and painting that's in the collection. This is George Inness. I couldn't believe it when I learned that this was in the collection, because this is one of my favorite paintings in all the world. I've looked at this painting now for so many years. Inness also, as you can see, did not go paint a known place and kind of in this literalist, allegorical way. He didn't have a preconceived idea. Inness was a devotee of Swedenborg, who was this kind of mystic theologian who was very important to in Boston at the time that we're talking about. Swedenborg influenced Emerson. He was very big for Henry James Sr., the father of William James, who became the great psychologist. Varieties of religious experience, that's William James. And also of Henry James, of course. So Swedenborg also argued theologically for erasing what separates us from God, or we could say from nature, from reality. Okay? So this is what I do with this painting, is I take a part of it and I flip it, and I've got Rothko, or something. You know, I'm Diebenkorn. I'm in the 20th century now, aren't I? Yeah. I wanted to show you a few other Innesses and what I do with them. You see, this is a bad. This is another painting of mine, blown up, tiny little painting. And now, when I go through the world, this is how I live in Los Angeles. And so I don't just look at the streetscape, but because of my relation with these painters and these artists and the pitches and patches that we're talking about, I now look up and I look at snippets of, and I alter my relationship to reality. This is Inness again. So you see? From this to this, and this is one of the patches. same thing. I want to end with a photo I took along the same lines, and a poem that I just think is so remarkable, and I'll read it to you. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. And by the way, we can read this completely secularly. But and I want to say something. Rilke was in Russia when he wrote this, and he was walking with Pasternak, you know, Dr. Zhivago, right? And Pasternak and Rilke were experiencing Russia together, and Russia at the time was a deeply religious place. The same kind of religiousness that influenced Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, right? And they were with the peasants, and they were having that full-on Russian experience, and very spiritual. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing. Embody me, flare up like a flame, and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. And for me, beyond just overwhelming kind of experience I always have of reading this poem, that second to last, the penultimate stanza, nearby is the country they call life. This brings me back to Adam Zagajewski's the train, the wild train that takes you to a different country to look back at when divinity makes itself known, doesn't it? And then let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Again, this openness to both the dark and the light that we see in these great paintings. Also, just kind of as general advice. Yeah, I think I'll end it there. And Patsy, I don't know if you want to do any questions or anything like that. But,
if people do have
Yeah.
questions and you're willing, but I also, first of all, wanted to say thank you. I also wanted to remind you that outside afterwards, Andrew will be there to sign the marriage artist, and the bookstore will be out there to do that. So you'll have that opportunity. Are you okay with a couple of questions?
I am, if there are any questions. Yeah. Yes.
I went in the flower pictures by Heade. I wanted to ask you if you compared it to copper. What about O'Keeffe?
Yeah. Yeah, so there have been connections with O'Keeffe, but the thing is that O'Keeffe said that she'd already done her flower paints before she ever saw these. And that was part of the thing of Heade being not known yet. I mean, it took a while for Heade. It really wasn't until the 80s that really the entire kind of museum culture in America was looking at Heade again. So, but I think they're definitely, in terms of isolation, the erotic, the ecstatic, visionary relationship. And I would also include an abstract painter in there, Agnes Martin, in this conversation. I would absolutely put Martin with O'Keeffe and with Dickinson, and indeed going back to Heade and Emerson and some of these important, really the most important figures from the mid to late 1800s. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
One more.
Yeah.
Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Yes.
Thanks to God for dapple things.
Yes. Perfect. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I love Hopkins. It's been very important to me. And it's very similar to this idea of that we only make contact in flickers and flashes with that kind of unnamableness, that ongoingness. Right? We have the sense that there's this kind of, I really do like the word plenitude, because I think it's the opposite of despair. Okay? The nihilistic position, the nihilist would say, there's no meaning, We can't know if there's a God or not. There doesn't seem to be, perhaps, in this modern secular scientific world. Therefore, we despair. You know, you look at Sartre, for example, nausea, despair. But I think that these thinkers had it right in my book, and better, which is that plenitude, abundance, and standing up where you're most weak with strength, these are the better answers than despair, it seems to me. And Hopkins is another great example. Yeah. I think that the idea, though, of dappled, flickers, patches, this seems to me right. Many of us have had these moments, but they only last a little while, sometimes just a minute or a second. These moments of contact and insight.
Thank you.
Nice to know.